Bright, sunny photos. Today we're gonna be editing photos shot in direct sunlight, and what better place to do that than the home of GTA 6 and Horatio Caine, Miami Beach. But before we get to the edit, it's important to shoot with the edit in mind. And over the last few days, we've captured some photos that I want to share with you, but more importantly, the tips that I like to keep in mind when shooting photos in direct sunlight. Underexpose. If you take a look at this view right now, you might notice that there's no information in the clouds. But if I drop my exposure ever so slightly, I get that back. Now that might be too much, so you kind of want to find a happy balance. And the reason you want to underexpose is if you do the opposite and you overexpose and your highlights are gone, the information is clipped, you can't get it back. Versus if you underexpose, what ends up happening is you get just a little bit more noise and a little bit more graininess in the shadows, but at least you have the information versus if you overexpose and you can't get that information back. So, underexpose, don't overexpose. You might notice that all these tips have to do with lighting. Shooting in direct sunlight is hard because you're trying to capture the highlight, the white detail, and the shadow detail. And most cameras can't do all of that at once. So one thing you can do is fill in the shadows with supplemental light, or you can fill it in with a reflector or a bright surface. Or in this case, because we were on the beach earlier, you could fill it in with sand, you could fill it in with concrete. You know, like a lot of the buildings here are white, so you could literally just, it's a perfect bounce. You could literally just stand beside the building and even out the shadows for a much better photo, or a much better photo to edit. The other option is to actually embrace the harsh lighting. So rather than trying to compensate with additional light, is just go for the fact that you're gonna have a stylized look to your photos. One option is you kind of just do like the split lighting effect, where maybe part of your subject is in the shadow, part of your subject is in the light. The other option is you can do a backlighting effect. So if you do have the sun visible inside your frame, put the sun directly behind your subject, which will give more of like a edge light or a hair light, or essentially this halo that outlines your subject and creates more contrast, separating them from the background. Now, maybe you've already shot your photos and you didn't know some of those tips about looking at the lighting direction and underexposing. Well, that's okay, because we're gonna take a look at this photo, which I actually did underexpose, but because we were shooting in Miami and it was so sunny and so bright and the light was just hitting me on this side of my face, you can see that it is a little bit blown out. Now I could drag the exposure down and there is information there, but that's not what I want my photo to look like. So I'm actually gonna bring that up. Now, remember this, because we're gonna come back to that highlight and fix it. I'll show you a trick on how to do that in just a minute. But what I'm paying attention to here is the histogram. And when I hover my mouse over any point of my skin, what I'm really looking for is a percentage of about 60, 70, 80%. So that's probably good. I could probably bring it up just a little bit, but now my photo looks washed out. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab my highlights, drag those back down, and my whites. Now my white is the whitest point of this photo. And again, if you pay attention to the histogram, as I drag this down, you can see that's exactly the tones and the portion of this image that we're bringing back down so that the exposure isn't super crazy bright. And then once you've gotten those first three adjustments to a point where you're happy, take a look at the dark tones inside of your photo. So that's, you know, the area around this camera, maybe some of the details in my hair. And if it feels a little bit too dark, that's when you're gonna want to maybe raise the shadows a little bit, or if it looks a little bit too flat, you can actually lower the shadow a little bit, and that will bring back some of that contrast. And much like we had that white point, we also have the black point. So I'm gonna drag that down too, because I feel like it does need a little bit more contrast. At this point, if your photo looks a little bit too blue or a little bit too yellow, this is where you're gonna wanna play with that white balance. Now, I had mine set to auto, and for most of my photos, that's what I tend to shoot in. So I'm just gonna leave it as shot because to me, that looks pretty good. Texture, clarity, dehaze, these are all things that you can adjust to your personal taste. Most of the time I like to drop the clarity a little bit, and then if the photo's feeling maybe not quite saturated enough, this is where I'll go in and just bump that just a little bit. When we move down the Lightroom panels, that's where we get to curves and color and hue and saturation. This is gonna be very much to personal taste, depending on the colors that you wanna pull out of your photo. And in my case, this is where I'll jump in right away to either my presets or the built-in Lightroom presets, just to kind of see what's possible with this edit. Like if I want something that's really moody, maybe I'll do a more dark earth style of a preset, or if I want something that's maybe a little bit more my typical style, like the Ivory Ridge preset or some of my new presets, which I can't talk about yet because they're not officially out. But my Thunderbird preset, for example, is one that I designed specifically with a daylit portrait in mind, but it's also a preset that is kind of my new general all-around purpose preset. But again, we're not gonna deal with presets. We're gonna do this color grading, these curves, all that from scratch. So for the coloring on this photo, what I wanna do is give it that warm vacation tropical look, you know, kind of like Miami, Florida style. So I'm gonna take some of those blues, shift them towards aquas, not make too many radical adjustments. Now there are some yellows in these palm trees and I really want them to look green. Definitely saturating the skin tones, maybe giving the skin tones a little bit more luminosity here, and then actually dropping the luminosity of those blue tones, because when I lower that, it'll actually make them look like they're a little bit richer, a little bit more saturated. You do have to use this in moderation, so don't go super crazy. And then under color grading, to kind of remove contrast and make this photo feel a little bit brighter, I'm gonna raise the shadows and then add a little bit of blue, and then in the midtones. Now, because we set our midtones to around that 60-70% brightness point, simply by adding a little bit more orange, I'll be able to make my skin tones look warmer. And then again, contrast that by adding a little bit of a blue teal tinge to my highlights and then dropping that back down. Because again, if you've seen any of my tutorials on color grading, you know that you can't add color to something that is white and blown out. You can only add color to gray. So by dropping the brightness of the highlights, we're able to pull more color in those white areas. Now this is good, but it's not perfect. I'm gonna show you one trick under the tone curve here. Now, normally people would jump in and start to do these really harsh S curves, but that doesn't look good for this type of photo. I'm actually gonna leave my black point, my shadows pretty much where they are. And yeah, I can raise my highlights, my white points, but I'm actually gonna drag that white point down. And what you can see is, much like in color grading where I'm able to add more color, you can see that it's flattened out the harshness of those highlights and even a little bit of that highlight that's on my forehead, but we still need to fix that. This doesn't quite fix that problem exactly. We could go into, say, the blue tone curve, which is blue and yellow, and if I start putting some points on it, and let's say I do the same thing where I drop that white point, maybe you're starting to see it here, but I'm adding a little bit of color to that highlight. Now, I zoom out, you can see there's a problem here. It kind of looks too yellow. So I'm gonna leave that channel alone. I'm gonna reset it. And now we're gonna jump into masking. Under masking, the first thing I wanna do is select those clouds. So the best way for me to do that is actually to select luminance range, which kind of means like brightness range. And in this case, I'm gonna select this cloud area. Now you can see it's over selected. It's also selected some of the blue areas. Now I can refine this I can drag it out so that it's smoother, or if I really want to select all the tones, the dark tones in my image, I can go like that. But really all I want is the very brightest portion of my image. And I'm just gonna drag this to a point where it's a smooth selection. We're not quite removing those blue areas of the sky, so I'm gonna say subtract linear gradient, and then I'm gonna drag this and say, okay, just give me that lower portion of the sky. That's the portion that we really wanna fix. Now within that mask, I can go to my blue tone curve, and if I start pulling it, you can see that I'm dragging the white point of my selection, so it's making it very blue, too blue. So I'm actually gonna go into the red tone curve, which has a little bit more cyan, and drag that down. And again, this is all just playing with it to see how much more blue do we wanna add. Actually, that probably looks good right there. So if I just toggle it on and off, you can see it's kind of removed that boring gray, yellowish cloud area. And now my whole background is looking way more blue. In photos where I have a subject or a person, I do like to increase the clarity and increase the exposure ever so slightly. So in this case, I'm gonna say select person, give me a second, select entire person. Now I have a mask that's just selecting me, and I can simply go into the exposure, just bump that a little bit, or if I wanna pull out more of the black details, I can say bump that. Again, it's just slight adjustments that will improve the overall look of this photo. I actually like to do the same thing on my sunglasses, where I'll do a little bit of a brush and then just boost the saturation or boost the exposure. Just play with the tone curves for that specific area so my sunglasses are popping a little bit more. One more mask that I like to add to really emphasize the direction of the sun is simply just a radial gradient that I'll throw in the corner and then either boost the exposure or boost the dehaze, just to kind of give it this like a bloom effect, if you want to call it that, or look like the sun is really hitting from a specific direction. One more tip, since this is a new feature that Lightroom now has, is when you've selected something, in this case, I'm going to select this camera, and you might notice that it has a little bit of a green tinge to it. That's because I'm standing on grass. You can't actually tell, but I want to remove that green color cast because it doesn't look good on the product. So I'm actually going to go into, now that I have my mask, go into the point color for that mask and say, select the green, and then simply just desaturate it. This is a huge game changer that Lightroom has introduced in the last few months, that if you're not happy with the colors in a specific portion of your photo, you can really go in and fine tune them. Now, having seen all these methods, you probably have figured out how we're gonna solve that little highlight that's on my forehead. We could use a point color and shift it. We could use a luminance range. We could use a brush. In my case, I think the best way to do it is with luminance range. So I'm gonna do this and just select that highlight portion. You can see it's over selected. So again, we have to go in and say subtract. I'm gonna say subtract the background because we don't need the sky to be selected anymore. We just want that one portion of my forehead and maybe some of the portions of my arm. And honestly, just looking at it, looks like it's done a good job, but if it's slightly too harsh, what you can do is you can again go into that luminance range and just feather it out by dragging the tail point of that little luminance range slider. And then once you've got that selection, there's multiple ways you can fix this. My personal favorite is to go into the tone curves and simply drop the white point on the main tone curve. And if you want to add a little bit of color, you can either go into the blue tone curve to add a little bit of yellow, or the red tone curve and just drag that point and boost maybe the midpoints depending on the tones that you're working with. But that is by far the easiest way and the fastest way to solve any of those blown out highlight areas that you have in your image. Keep in mind, this isn't gonna work on every photo. If you have areas of your image that are just completely blown out altogether, you won't be able to solve this problem. But in a case like this, or in a case of some of these other photos where I'm being backlit and maybe the sky doesn't have as much color, or there's certain areas of the photo that I wanna fix, this is one tip that you definitely need to keep inside your Lightroom editing arsenal. And that's it for this one. If you enjoyed this video, let me know down in the comments below. What other Lightroom tips, what other style of photography would you want me to run through in a similar format to this video, where I show you some photo tips, and then maybe just show you how to do some of the editing behind the scenes. And of course, if you're looking for a way to speed up your edits, make sure you check out my Lightroom presets down in the description below. And until the next one, grab your camera, get out, and go shoot photos.
Today we're talking about shooting in harsh sunlight, how you do it, how to get good photos in this not so good weather.
Are you qualified to talk about this, sir?
I feel like it.